his questioning. He's going to call a brief recess. I'll be back and we can resume then. Thanks, Senator Lee.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate you accommodating me in that regard. Thanks to each of you for being here today. You know, the Second Amendment guarantees our right to keep and bear arms. This was a right that our founding fathers deemed fundamental, so much so that they added it to the text of the original Constitution. It's not only the Second Amendment that's at stake when we talk about things like this. There's also the concept of due process. The Fifth Amendment's due process clause, of course, provides that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That requirement is, of course, made applicable to the states through the 14th Amendment. You see, our freedom isn't free. Whenever government acts, it does so inevitably at the expense of individual liberty. That's where government has to get its power. We need government, and just the same, we need government to respect boundaries on its own authority. I certainly agree that we should take steps wherever possible to make sure that people who shouldn't have guns don't have them. In particular, those who are legally prohibited from having them because they're adjudicated as mentally unfit to do so. They've been convicted of a crime. These restrictions are consistent with our system of laws, and they can be applied in a manner that doesn't offend our constitutional rights. Ms. Gosar, I'm very touched by your testimony as I read through your written testimony. I couldn't help but notice that as you're talking about difficult things and the difficult circumstance in which you had to witness your own husband's murder, even while you had a firearm and had access to it, but you chose to comply with the law, your assailant did not. And I think you summarized it extremely well with just a few words. I obeyed that gun control law. My stalker did not. I don't think I've found any one sentence that better summarizes the need to respect the Second Amendment, the need to protect due process, and also the dilemma that we face and that we have to take into account whenever we choose to enact laws infringing upon those rights. It sounds to me like you would likely agree with the proposition that it's not a cost-free action for the government to take, that in the name of protecting people from the horrors of gun violence, government can also inflict violence. Would you care to elaborate on that, based on your experience?
Well, I think that there's some laws that are created that they have unintended consequences. I think some of these gun control laws were created thinking that, we're going to protect people. And unfortunately, it can make some people out there vulnerable so that they can't protect themselves and their loved ones. And, I don't want dangerous people to have access to guns, but you know what? I don't want them to have access to a vehicle or a knife or a baseball bat or a pressure cooker. I mean, if they're truly dangerous, of course, I want everyone to have due process. I believe murderers deserve due process and victims as well. That's what's so great about our country, that we do have due process and we do have a constitution. I don't want to live anywhere else. I love America, and I love that about America.
And yet it's sometimes suggested, and we've heard it suggested even just in the last few moments, that the worst that can happen if you take somebody's gun away without due process is that they have to go without it for a few days or for a couple of weeks. And yet your circumstance would seem to suggest that that is not true, that that is not the full extent of the downside of that there is more cost. And sometimes that cost is borne not just in an inconvenience, but in someone being left vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. In my case, it would have compounded the problem. Of course I was depressed. Who wouldn't be? Of course I had nightmares. Who wouldn't after going through that? But to take away my basic human right of self-defense on top of all of that would just be devastating for someone like me.
Sometimes people will argue due process is great and everything, but with respect to the bad folks, well, we can't give them due process. Isn't that the problem with due process itself? I mean, if we're going to respect due process, aren't we agreeing up front that due process needs to be up front? It's not really due process if it's only after the fact. Is that right?
That is right. And I understand it can be very scary. I mean, I get it. I get it. I'm a victim of a violent crime. But like I said, if you truly believe that someone is a danger, they should be confined to a mental facility, but they should have due process. And that's why I support the Baker Act and similar laws that already exist all across the nation. Every state has a similar law to that because it includes due process. Your legal fees are covered. They're not under red flag laws. You know, I don't have $10,000 to cover legal fees. It can be very, very expensive. And with the Baker Act and similar laws, mental health experts are involved. That's not always the case with red flag laws. And I think that's very important that mental health experts be involved in that due process.
Mr. Koppel, does lack of notice and due process, it sometimes might go along with gun confiscation orders, doesn't this have some potential to increase the risk of harm, both to law enforcement officers executing the orders and to those who are subject to those orders?
Sure. I mean, you imagine a situation where officers, there's a ex parte order that's been issued, and maybe it's on weak evidence and the guy's really not dangerous, but the confiscation order is served by the police showing up at somebody's house at 5 o'clock in the morning. Normally, or a homeowner might think it was a burglary, and because he has no idea that anybody's coming to take his guns. And there's also a broader problem in how it erodes trust between law enforcement and the public. And this was talked about in one of the Connecticut studies that's quoted in my written testimony. When you have somebody whose guns are taken away and confiscated, the police show up. I've never heard of anything going on against me, but now there's a cop coming to take my guns. As some Connecticut state police officers have reported, these are often the guys who think of themselves as the most pro-cop. They're the ones who are on back the blue, on the side of law enforcement, understand it's a tough job. And then all of a sudden, the guys they thought they were their friends are there to take away their property when it's a complete surprise to the person. And then maybe a few weeks later, the person hires a lawyer, goes into court, they get their guns back. But in the meantime, it's been a very humiliating process for the wrongly accused individual. And law enforcement, who I've often represented in amicus briefs in courts and elsewhere, are so dependent on the cooperation and goodwill of the public. That's the American model. We're not policing from above like in some other less free countries. So when these are done wrongfully, they really break that relationship and bond between the public and law enforcement that is necessary to successful law enforcement and public safety.
Mr. Koppel, there are a number of us, myself included, who have formed sort of a bipartisan coalition raising concerns in a related area of civil asset forfeiture, where in areas outside of firearms, we've raised concerns with law enforcement being able to take people's property first and then ask questions later, to take first and then provide some sort of process later. Due process, of course, has a higher expectation than that, does it not? And do you see tell me what you think about the parallel between this and that. In other words, if one is concerned about the potential for abuse and the actuality of abuse in the civil asset forfeiture arena, how could one not see something similar when it extends to the Second Amendment?
It's the same kind of situation. It is a similar kind of situation, and both have good intentions of trying to deal with a serious problem. Here, gun crime and civil asset forfeiture, it had always existed in kind of a minor way, but it really got ramped up in a huge way in the 70s and 80s because of the drug war. And of course, drug abuse can be very harmful, not only to an individual, but to society more broadly. And so the idea was, well, we need these tools to fight the drug lords and all this. And what happened was there were a lot of people whose property got taken who weren't Colombian drug lords or anything like that. And it was widely abused. And sadly, the courts, in their view of what the Constitution requires as a minimum for due process, generally said that's fine. So I would urge this, especially this committee of all committees in the United States, which is charged with defending the Constitution, that one of the reasons courts often defer to legislative judgments is they presume, just like Chief Justice Marshall said in McCulloch versus Maryland, that the legislature itself already seriously thought about constitutional rights and values. So I think legislators can and should go above whatever minimal level the judiciary will enforce in terms of the protection of people's procedural rights.
So insofar as we're talking about a due process right that is freestanding here, which I think we've agreed that there is, certainly a right doesn't lose protection by becoming a hybrid right. In other words, if you already have a freestanding independent due process right protected by the Fifth Amendment or the 14th Amendment's due process clause, you certainly don't see that any justification for diluting that right merely because you've added the Second Amendment into the equation by virtue of its involvement in the firearms arena.
Yes, at least as a policy matter, you would think due process would be all the stronger there. And of course, the analogy, as I'm sure you know, in the first Supreme Court's free exercise of religion jurisprudence, sometimes that free exercise of religion gets stronger protection when it's a hybrid in conjunction with the exercise of some other right.
Right, right. I've never quite understood the hybrid rights doctrine in the First Amendment context beyond what you just described, which is that it certainly doesn't get weaker when you compound one right with another. And I would maintain that that is no less true here. Consistent with the directive I was given from the chairman when he left to go vote, I hereby recess this hearing of the subcommittee subject to the call of the chair, who will be back momentarily. Thank you.